morning, everyone. This is Kim Fleming. We appreciate calling in and joining the WebEx webinar today, Conflict Resolution in an Educational Context. This is part of a series. It's actually a follow-up to the series on socioeconomic demographics. We are recording the webinar. There are new series. This is the first of three in building relationships through leadership in community development. This is a work with Pension Administration, our organizational development and accountability team, working with and also community and economic vitality. So we're thrilled to be working together to present these webinars. We've had all kinds of interest. I think we've got 93 people who have registered, maybe more, for these, at least one of these 6 webinars, and today we've got over 70 registered for David Kay's presentation on conflict resolution. So I've got David here with me. I'm going to be turning it over to David soon. David is a senior extension associate in Department of Sociology and in CARDI, and I'm going to let David take it from here, introduce himself, and welcome you all.
Greetings and good morning to everybody. Thank you for joining us. Assuming you can hear me, but if you can't, I think there will be, if not already, chat possibilities that Kim will track. So please let her know if there's any problems in following what we're trying to do. Kim suggested at one point that I activate my camera, and I decided that a better option would be to put a picture of me from about 15 years ago up there with my webpage at the Department of Development. Sociology as a form of introduction, so you can kind of read a little bit about my background there while I'm just getting going here if you want to. The only thing that I think is not there that's probably relevant to what I'm going to talk about today is about maybe 15 years ago or 20 years ago or so, as I was on a municipal planning board in my community and went through a very controversial land use planning issue as a board member. I got invited to, some years afterwards, become trained as a conflict mediator. So I'm now actually a practicing mediator with our local community dispute resolution center, and a lot of what I've learned about conflict has come as someone who's been trained and as a practitioner as a mediator. So I'm going to, at this point, with occasional guidance, try and work through the webinar technology, which this is my first time kind of in this role, so I have a little patience. I think I know what I'm doing, but if
you
not,
know what you're doing. Sure you do.
I'm going to stop. Okay, so now we're back to the beginning. And this is going to be what I'm going to try and talk through during the next hour or so, with some deviations because I tend to be a little scattered even when I'm trying to be organized. So, but this is the basic flow of what I'm going to work through. One is I'm going to talk about the nature of public issues and conflict in the work. Now I'm going to talk about the range of approaches to working with conflict that you can draw upon to help communities, and I put communities in quote because while I typically work with communities of place and other places, I'm not everything I said is only applicable to communities of place. There are other kinds of communities and groups, and maybe even broader to the word that some of these principles apply to. I'm going to focus in a little bit in that context on the role of information provision because it's such an essential part of, I think, what many of us do as educators. And I'm going to kind of expand that then also to look at the different kinds of roles that educators play. I'll draw on some survey research we did some years back. Address the whole issue of education and advocacy, and maybe we can, as much as possible on this format, try and have a little dialogue and back and forth about what those kinds of things are. And I will say that this topic is one that is, it's easier to do it in a very interactive format, and this format is only has limited interaction capacity, so going to be some tend to think, the old idea about the medium is the message. To some extent, this medium is conflicting with the message that I want to give, but I think it'll work to some extent in any event.
May I add just a little tip here? I think everyone's been WebEx before, but if you are sending a note to David, it does help to send it to everyone, which is a choice in the chat. It's a drop-down where it says send to. The very top selection is everyone, so if you want to send a question, it's nice for the whole group to that, or respond to one of David's requests. So we do ask that everyone engage fully and participate. This is a wonderful workshop. I've been through this before.
Right, I've done a version of this workshop possibly with some of you before, so while it's changed to some extent, I apologize if some of this looks familiar to some of you at least. And I'm also making an assumption that almost everybody on the call is an extension educator or affiliated with the extension system, so I'm addressing my remarks and contextualizing things in that way. And if there is anyone who's not an extension educator, I hope you can translate whatever I say into your context. So Steve Smutko is a colleague I've worked with on and off over the years, who's actually a statewide faculty member. He used to be in North Carolina. He's now at Wyoming, and he's one of a small group of people who work on these kinds of issues full time. And these kinds of issues meaning an extension that this have historically called public issues education. So I'm going to draw to start with from his work, in part because he's a great resource person. He's now in Wyoming. This kind of work. It has changed over time is really what he's addressing here, and more direct work with citizens and agencies around various kinds than, at least in his experience and in my experience, was true in the past. And we're both, I should mention, we're both in our mid to late 50s, so our perspective goes back probably 30 plus years on these things. Many of our issues that we deal with are complex, contentious, and potentially divisive. Many of them have lots of more data available to address them than was true in the past, in part because of the internet and the access that we all have and many other people have, and computing power as well. It's just night and day from when I started doing this kind of work. And increasingly, I think you're all familiar with this, that science itself can be fueling controversy, but the controversy can be about the science and the role of scientists and the role of experts in making decisions about these kinds of issues. I also wanted to note, because this is the 80-20 rule, and then the rule again is in quotes because it's more of a rule of thumb than a rule. That's my little thumb there, right there. Okay. I think a general, easy to understand practical rule of thumb, which is that in almost every context, that a relatively small number of issues or problems or things that we're working on dominate our time. Other things that are routine, that we can get through in a pretty routine way. But particularly in this context, controversial topics often take up a very highly disproportionate proportion of time and energy, and there's people that have, in a rule of kind of way, quantified that as 20% of the issues take up 80% of the time. And there's actually academic work that's been done to kind of look at this kind of thing, and I have a quote from one of the guys that really started that kind of thinking. So what characterizes these types of issues? Solutions are not self-evident. Participants have deep disagreements on the way to solve them. There is discretion in it. It's not like 100% dictated, so decision makers do have latitude in how to approach this, which isn't always true. And it tends to be that these are big, important decisions that have far-reaching impacts for many people. particularly using the decision-making systems that we usually approach these with, it's likely that whatever the decision is, it's likely to be challenged by somebody who's unhappy with the outcome. Let's see if I can move now. There's another kind of tradition that's developed that kind of comes at the same ideas from a different angle. I don't know if anybody's heard of this notion of wicked problems. The opposite of wicked problems has kind of entered the terminology, I think, in some popular and academic circles, and it's penetrated pretty far. The opposite, which has term has not penetrated so far, is the idea of tame problems. Really? But I think of them as being more like routine problems. So what characterizes these? The constraints, you'll find some similarities here, but it's just framed in a different way. The constraints that the problem is subject to and the resources needed to solve it change over time. So there isn't a single solution that's going to last for all time. The problem is never solved definitively. The next two I'm highlighting because I think they're almost the most important aspects of this. One is that the solution depends on how the problem is framed, and implicitly who is framing it, and vice versa. So there's codependency between solution and how the problem is even defined. And because stakeholders have different worldviews on these things, there are very different frames for understanding the problem that are all in play simultaneously. So this is just like I just put on the bottom of the screen just a list of the types of issue areas in which wicked problems typically arise. And I'm not going to read them, but, you know, there's the et ceteras could go on forever. So I'm going to take sort of a little bit of a picking up on that idea of framing. I'm going to just do this little thing because it's a little story I like about a conflict. And you can read it on the screen, but I'll read it aloud too. So, and I'll tell you, I call it a fugitive resource is the heading too. A lawyer went duck hunting in rural New York. He shot and dropped a bird, but it fell into a farmer's field on the other side of a fence. As he climbed over the fence, an elderly farmer drove up on his tractor and asked him what he was doing. And I guess that some of you folks out there know this elderly farmer, and some of you probably know the lawyer. The lawyer responded, "I shot a duck, fell in this field, and now I'm going to retrieve it." The farmer replied, "Ha! This is my property, and you're not coming over here." The lawyer said, "I'm one of the best trial attorneys in Manhattan, and if you don't let me get that duck, I'll sue you and take everything you own." The lawyer smiled and said, "Apparently, you don't know how we settle disputes around here. We have small disagreements like this with the upstate 3-kick rule." The lawyer asked, "What's that?" The farmer replied, "Well, because the dispute occurs on my land, first, I kick you 3 times, and then you kick me 3 times, and so on back and forth until someone gives up." So the attorney quickly thought about the proposed contest and decided he could easily take the old codger. He had to abide by the local custom. The farmer slowly climbed down from the tractor and walked up to the attorney. First, kick planted the toe of his steel-toed work boot into the lawyer's groin and dropped him to his knees. Sorry for the violence here, by the way. The second kick to the midriff had him gasping for breath. They were on all fours when the farmer's third kick to his rear sent him face first into a fresh cow pie. He limited every bit of his will and managed to get to his feet. Wiping his face with the arm of his jacket, he said grimly, "Okay, you old coot, now it's my turn." Farmer smiled and said, "Nah, I give up. You can have the duck." What's the point there? Why did I do that? Framing. You know, was the issue really about the duck? That's what they were ostensibly arguing about, right? So the point I think is obvious, but I'll draw it out because I can't see your faces, just in case you're looking baffled. You know, they went into a problem into a conflict, and each of them really had a very different sense of what the whole problem was about, and their resolutions that they each wanted were very different, and basically the guy who thought he was going to will that dispute, I had no clue what it was really about for the other guy, and probably vice versa. Now, what was that about a fugitive, what I call it a fugitive resource, and this is one of my little tangents, but there's a whole legal tradition of fugitive resources, things essentially that move through the landscape around things like wildlife, like water, things that can be captured by somebody, but maybe on somebody else's land initially. And so and hunters are a typical legal problem, and there's a long legal history of trying to deal with these things about actually who owns a resource that moves. And I do a lot of work, and Rod Howe is sitting here with me, also does, do a lot of work with shale gas and the controversy of shale gas. And shale gas and oil are another fugitive resource, which is the dispute about right now. So that was and we do a lot of work with that, and I know some of you out there in your counties also are working with energy-related issues like this. So if you look over on that Finders Keepers book, the subtitle is How the Law of Capture Has Shaped the World Oil Industry. That's just a reference to the enormous 100-year history of law that has developed essentially around this issue of who owns resources that can move in the landscape. And then we recently here at Cornell had several of the main interpreters of the shale gas controversy to the public, both in academia and in journalism, on opposite sides of the issue in many cases. And they gave a presentation for the Atkinson Center here at Cornell. And as you can see, despite the fact that on the right that they're worlds apart in their sense of what's happening, they're at least standing close enough to each other and smiling at the camera as if they were friends. And I think in some sense they actually are. They've made each other, to some extent, media stars in ways, which is good. And in my opinion, at least they're kind of made on the political spectrum exactly in perfect order. So we'll move on. Us as educators, but when people in general are in conflict, what's the kind of standard response on public issues? A natural and very common and traditionally dominant one is to take an adversarial stance. Circle the wagons is the metaphor. You try and ignore complaints. You depend on essentially various sources of power you have to get the outcome that you want. And typically that's political or legal in most of these kinds of arenas. And they're kind of an old, we'll use this very much anymore, but when I was in graduate school, this was called the decide, announce, and defend approach to policy, the DAP approach. And that terminology is at least fairly common. Typically what I'm an advocate of in these big controversial kinds of cases is a much more inclusive stance. Trying to communicate proactively, involving stakeholders up front, solve problems collectively, seeking mutual gains, which is a term that comes out of particularly labor relations kind of tradition of negotiation, involving neutral parties, very often but not always, people like extension educators potentially, facilitators and mediators where needed, sometimes in formal ways, sometimes in just informal ways. And I'm sorry, I just made this one up last night on the fly, but I would call that mediated openness and mutuality to be the MOM, alternative to DAD. And there are some interesting research about gender affinities and proclivities for each of these kinds of approaches to dealing with conflict, but I won't go into that at this point. This is another slight tangent, but I really think it's really important to understand about the context in which we, as Americans, are actually doing our work. this is a quote that says, "Conflict is the essential core of a free and open society." If we project the democratic way of life in the form of a musical score, its major theme would be the harmony of dissonance. So that's the point where I want to try a poll.
Okay, you can go right down to the
Poll. And that. And I open.
I'm going to go to your file.
Oh, right. And I now go to this. And I just want to see, and then I show it. How do I? Poll, right. Okay. So I'm supposed to now see on your screen, and I'm going to go on a little bit, but I just want you to say whether you agree or disagree with that statement. And now, as you're doing that it's a book by probably one of the most well-known community organizers of the 1960s and 70s, in a book called Rules for Radicals, and he's actually perceived as a radical himself, as a kind of a leftist radical, but it's really interesting how almost everybody across the political spectrum, from the left to the right and in other countries, has actually picked up explicitly on a lot of his ideas about how to do community organizing. I think this will get you thinking about this, about whether you agree or disagree with this. And the reason I'm doing this is because I know empirically, most human beings, there's definitely outliers in this, but the majority of us respond to conflict in a way which, we like it, basically. We seek it out, we don't like it, we want to avoid it. So in some ways, this notion is like saying, if it's true or not, it's something that causes discomfort. Many, many people.
22 out of 30 have responded, and they keep coming.
Okay, so I'll leave it open while I go on. I wanted to draw attention at another level to some work I've been reading recently, and I also want to mention this because the group here that's involved with engaged learning and research is talking about bringing this author to campus sometime in the not-too-distant future. This is again about the idea of, what kind of democratic society do we live in? The author's name is Parker Palmer. He writes about some pretty common notions, but he writes very eloquently. So, one of the things that he writes about is that part of what democracy is all about is learning to hold tension creatively on, this is a term he didn't make up, but he borrowed it, and I like it a lot. It's on what he calls the loom of democracy, because if you think what the loom does is it has, I forget the warp and the woof, I'm sure many of you know, or even if I got the terms exactly right, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to weave the pattern through a frame that's printed to you that holds structure, all kinds of creativity. And what he writes in his book called Healing the Heart of Democracy is the idea that political life in a democracy is a nonstop flow of contradictions and conflicts. Founders created a form of government that maintains tension over time rather than rushing to resolve it prematurely and falsely, thus evoking a supply of human creativity that's never achieved when problems are resolved by fear. So, really important there is maintain tension, take time necessary to work through it, not jumping to conclusions too quickly, and the door to creativity. Those are the ideas that are really, I think, captured there. And then the founders, the institutions, this is really important, the institutions that they bequeath to us and that we all work with were not about providing answers to the big questions. They were about providing a framework so salient questions could continue to be debated without resorting to violence. And it's a really essential idea to understand is that democratic society, we are there to be continually permanently addressing questions to which there's probably not a right answer around these big, complex, what some other people much later are calling wicked problems.
The poll is timed
Okay,
shortly.
so I'm going to close the poll. It's not really that important. I just wanted you to think about it, but you can see that most people agreed with the statement.
Yeah.
So presumably there's a few of you who agree with that, who are conflict lovers. You just can't wait to get into an argument with somebody. But for most of you, you're recognizing reality and you're not that comfortable with it. I'm going to close the poll. Controversial public issues.
Waiting
So I can't do anything until it's done. Is that right?
10 seconds.
Acknowledge that there are some people that have no clue what he's talking about.
Right.
And I'm surprised because there was a lot packed into a very short thing, but I'm not surprised that it's confusing. So I wanted to go actually not to a poll, but at this point I want to invite you to start typing into the chat box around this question. And you type like, I know, or you can type a short little description of the type of public issues which might respond to this. So the question is, are there controversial public issues that have arisen in your communities? And I'm sure there are, because they're in everywhere, but I want you to think about it in terms of your jobs. Are these issues which raise or complicate the issue of whether or not or how you or your organization should be involved in the issue?
So are there any controversial issues that CCE should be involved in?
Right. So, for example, like if you're in a community that's dealing with shale gas, controversial in a lot of communities. If it's straightforward, you already knew exactly how to deal with that, you had no question about how you or your organization should be involved, then you don't have to answer this with a yes. You can say, no, I'm trying to get the sense of, is this like something that causes you a little stress in your job about how to deal with it?
So I'm going to encourage people to go up to the chat pod and hit the little orange triangle to open the chat pod, just so you can see it, because right now the polling is taking over.
Okay.
Plus, I think it's always good for CE as a system to know what the range of issues are statewide, where extension associations are trying to decide, and I'm talking specifically about these sort of controversial issues, might have an educational approach or not, because it's always good to know, well, who on campus is prepared to be involved with you as a partner to make sure there's accurate information, timely information. So it's always good for us to kind of know what some of these range of issues are.
Yeah. So in case you didn't recognize that voice, I think we mentioned it was Rod Howe. So, I think of it, if you haven't already, in terms of our core programming areas, and just threw in, my brainstorm last night of things that I've either worked on myself or talked to other people about, personal memory.
Getting lots of feedback here. That's
great. I'm not going to take, because we have a lot of time, I'm not going to take the time to read through things, but I want you all to kind of be looking at these kinds of topical areas and see the diversity there. And maybe for all of us here who are trying to help think through these issues, to also pay attention to the list here, kind of think about how can we help each other deal with the fact that these are, to some extent, cause some difficult decisions about what we do. I obviously wrote this next slide, what characterized these issues, before I saw all of this list, so I was guessing what characterizes many of these issues, and I'm probably going to be wrong about some of it. I'm going to guess that some of what I'm going to put up now is going to be relevant, and you can type in if you think I'm missing something important. One, and this is related to some of the other lists I already had up earlier about wicked problems and things like that, but I'm trying to focus more on the specific kinds of issues now. Complexity. I emphasized earlier about even defining what the issue is not clear-cut and depends to some extent on your worldviews and the worldviews of the participants. Very often, in fact, most often, there's a large number of participants. There's clarity who is affected, and in the terminology of conflict resolution, that's often who's a, quote, stakeholder. The people who are affected, some of them are very highly organized, and some of them have absolutely no organization whatsoever. The big issues, not necessarily very often just the little ones, so the stake, and very often the real stake in outcomes and what happens is very large, and it often starts in a situation, always, but it often starts in a situation where there's already polarization and cleavage in a community around other issues, and this issue deepens those divisions within a community. Certainly, there can be situations where there isn't division in a community that's very significant, and this will create it. These kinds of issues create it. And another thing is to be very aware of, and that we're very aware of in the conflict work we do, is it's not just the outcome that matters. It's also who's involved, the personalities, what their value systems are, the fairness of the process, the procedures that are used, the histories that people have had from one high school versus another high school. It's just and that's important in these kinds of big community level issues. And as we said earlier, conflict and controversy often create fear in and of itself, and people have fear reactions, and that includes educators, it includes participants, except for a small minority of people who just really seek it out and love it. In their element with this, because they have a lot more power in a way in those kinds of contexts than the rest of us. And I am one of those people. I became a mediator in part because I am terrified, or I was. I'm not as much as I used to be, but I used to be really terrified of any kind of conflict whatsoever.
That's saying you were a conflict lover.
No. But why should we all as educators, to some extent, be conflict lovers? And there's some reasons. One is it does create opportunities for learning and change. And if it's part of our democracy, as most of you thought, if it's part of our fundamental way of being in the world, then maybe it's good to sort of learn how to harness the energy that's always there in controversy to educational ends. And I'll read that little I think the biggest, I have a picture of a present there, or a gift, and I think the biggest gift that conflict gives to educators is a gift of attention. Because I can't think of how many times, it's great ideas and material, and, you just don't get people showing up. They're too busy doing other things. So around issues that are important, conflict gives us their attention. It's not always the kind of attention we really want. So the trick is to figure out how do we take advantage of the attention and translate it into something that's constructive. And ourselves are alert to how to do that and trained in how to do that, then we can look within conflict for what I and other people might call teachable moments. Something that is easy to do, but I think that it's a skill that can be learned, and it's not. There are many possibilities for taking advantage of conflict to move people from where they start to maybe a more positive, constructive way of thinking about the issues that they're concerned about. And if you can't read the cartoon, it says, "My teacher said I don't pay enough attention in class." At least that's what I think she said. What we need to learn to address conflict more constructively is kind of summarized often in the idea of inclusive collaborative processes, the MOM kind of approach rather than the DID kind of approach. And this is the goal. Why should we bother with that? It's because this is some work from one of the luminaries in this field, Larry Susskind, who wrote a book in '87 when I was in graduate school here.
Prickly pear fruit. First start with a peeled prickly pear.
Huh?
On your cutting board horizontally.
Where did that come from?
Next, we're going to make some cut pear fruit. You'll notice start off with a pear has prickly pear. You don't want to use
Excuse me, we're having a little technical problem here.
Next, we're going to make it into your strainer. You'll notice that the prickly pear has strainer and a mixer. You don't want to use this as caution.
I don't know what's going on.
Next, I'm going to take the back of the
tripod.
YouTube channel.
and that's going to put your strainer and the prickly pear that catches
So
all
what
the
I'm
juice.
going to do,
I'm going to take
Can
the
you
back of the
pause?
plate and push it on through. And that's going to
where's my
some of the
sound?
prickly pear juice.
Here.
Oh, it's over here. Click on that.
And that's
Wait a
going
minute.
to use the prickly pear.
Mhm.
Oh.
And that's how you
No,
use
it's
No.
still on. Try one more time. Get the pause.
Things open at once.
Well, now
So
we
now
know it
we
was
go-
prickly pear juice.
Oh, how do I go back to where I was?
Are you in stop sharing? Go right to the green.
Green
Yeah.
one, okay. All right, sorry about that. So anyway, Larry Susskind has sort of, one of the things he thought is what are the criteria for a good resolution to a conflict? And he has this idea that resolution is one that's fair, efficient, and wise. I'm not going to go too deep into that because you could talk about that for a long time, and we had a whole class on that with John Forrester in City and Regional Planning when I was a grad student. But I think the idea is it's less likely to be challenged. When you get to the resolution, it's going to stick in place for longer because more people have bought into it as being a good outcome, even if they didn't get everything they wanted out of it initially. It saves money by focusing on what people really care about in the language of conflict resolution. That's underlying interests rather than the positions that they started to hold. So it's an efficient type of outcome. It allows a larger range of interests to be addressed than is by the others because it's an inclusive process, and in that sense, it's more likely to be stable in the sense I just talked about, and it's also more likely to be fair because it includes more people's concerns. And maybe most importantly, instead of just picking up the existing pie and win-lose kind of framework, it seeks creative solutions that might not have been possible to have come to, since it's a water solution. And I think very, very important, and communities in particular, the probability is that it's going to better lasting relationships and community, or at least not do as much damage as many as approaching these kinds of conflicts from other perspectives often does. So I switch gears now because we're running out of time. I'm going to try and speed up a little bit. So a list of roles that extension educators play. I've based on a lot of work of some of my colleagues in other states and so on, and the point here is that there are a lot of them. You don't just do one thing. And I want to draw on some survey work that we did in the 90s, and I bet this has changed a little bit, but not all that much since the 90s. So sort of where we analysis of what educators were actually doing when they're involved in various issues in their community, and got some numbers as a response. And before I do that, I just want to point that I am not saying that everybody who's an extension educator should or arguably could do all of these things, even if they were skilled in all of them. Obviously, that's not the case. It's not possible to do all of these things. What's important is to think about all of these roles are things that might be done by somebody in some appropriate context, and also that they're learnable skills that you can get better at.
Or at times, if it's not an extension educator, we might bring in a operator.
Very important is that often, because you're an extension, that may be a reason why you can't do one of these things in the context you're in, because extension may be perceived as, for example, being someone who is not neutral enough around agricultural issues in the community to be a convener or a facilitator or a mediator. But you might be able to get somebody else if you know that that's an important role to play. So basically, everybody provided technical assistance or information directly. A lot of us were conveners. A lot of us were in facilitation roles. A lot of us were designing processes, interaction processes. A lot of us were building coalitions. And in that survey that I did.
A question in the chat on the definition of a shuttle diplomat.
Okay, I would say that is someone who actually plays out of international diplomacy. It's a common term there, but it's basically a mediator or a diplomat who, instead of convening everybody in the same room to work through an issue, what they do is they'll go to talk to one party in a conflict in their home turf and listen to what they're saying. Then they go and talk to another one on their home turf and listen to what they're saying. And to some extent, they carry messages back and forth. And they don't necessarily have an agenda about, they might, but they don't necessarily have their own agenda. But their function that they're playing is to really the different parties in a conflict communicate with each other and in that way try and discover whether there's common ground. And often that's a preliminary to bringing them to the table together, but it doesn't need to be. Just be a way to pass information back and forth. I wanted to acknowledge also the work of Scott Peters on campus, although he's temporarily off campus in Syracuse. I appreciate his work in trying to look very closely at what it is that extended educators actually do in their jobs as opposed to what their job descriptions say they do and the way that they actually talk about what they do and even maybe think about what they do. Because I think what his publication he put out and others, if you really look at what you do hour by hour, day by day, you'll realize that you actually do draw on many, many more of those skill sets and roles in your work than probably is there in your job description about what you do. So, maybe my particular technical skill, if you will, and part of what I probably can get hired to do in lots of places is do economic analysis. That doesn't mean that the only thing I do in my job is economic analysis, etc. I wanted to focus now on information provision for a little bit because I think that's so common in the work we do, and it is central, I think, to a lot of the work we do as educators. And I think there's a good argument to be made that it is the essential core of a lot of what we do. But the problem is that when we're to do that, we often head further into the reality of people don't necessarily want the information we have, or they don't accept the information we have, or they come listen to us. And the reality is that there's actually a growing, even the popular press, there's growing attention to the idea that a lot of us actually, after we've started thinking about an issue for a little while, we become vested in, or we have a certain worldview. We actually want some information about the problem out of context, particularly when controversy is involved and evolved. And sometimes information provision actually has the perverse effect of bringing us to, here's something that contradicts our worldview, let's say pro-fracking, anti-fracking, whichever side of that one we've already decided we're on. We contradicts our worldview, and the immediate psychological response is to think of everything we can possibly think of to dismiss the argument we just heard, whether it's right or wrong. More convinced that we were right before we heard than when we initially heard this contradictory information. Very common kind of psychological response. A lot of interesting psychological research on that, which is actually summarized in this, to some extent, in this article on Fact-Free Nation. So part of what my conclusion out of reading about this is a part of our jobs, which I think we actually do a lot of, is not just delivering information, but creating a context for learning. Especially when controversy exists, that becomes more and more important. How do we do that? I wanted to move now to draw just a little bit on from I ran across recently about by some environmental education educators about categories that they see in their work that they do. And one of them, which is kind of the first one we were just talking about, was conveying information. But another one, and I think these are sort of distinct areas with distinct strategies of what you might do in educational work. Another one is building understanding, improving skills, and then in their work and in the environment, what they're trying to figure out, how do they change behavior of the people they're working with to encourage sustainability. When you start thinking about what do we do as educators, it's a little bit useful to go, I'm not an expert in sort of education theory, but I think I've run across enough of it to sort of be interested, and there's a really long history of how we think about educating people. This is just more like a little historical note to realize how much that thought has about how to do that well has changed in just the history of the U.S. Over the past 100 years or so. And I think it's useful to note that there was kind of an empty vessel idea in education that was there until not that long ago, really, which is the basic idea, very common in Europe, I know. The idea was that you fill people with information because they didn't have anything there. Or, this other one up here about the common educational theory in the early 19th century was that you actually had to break the will of wild and resistant pupils and subdue their spirit in order to be able to get them to accept the information you wanted. But I really like this. I discovered that this Latin root of the word education, educare, actually means to draw out what lies within, which I think is a really interesting idea about a different way, radically different way of thinking about what we do. And that notion was really focused on and brought out in a lot of mid-19th century experience, particularly associated with the Transcendentalist movement in the United States, which is very strong in New England and New York. So we're kind of in the center of that historical way of thinking. And this guy, Pestalozzi, was an important thinker that a lot of people paid attention to at that time period. So we're going to shift from the past and again to this is mainly here as a resource that's available to draw attention to. But again, some of the colleagues I've worked with, including Steve Smutko and Kay Holland, together I was supposed to leave time. Is what you're talking about?
Okay.
Particularly handle scientific and technical information in contentious public issues. I'm going to hurry because I'm taking longer here. And they actually have a workbook that goes with that provides a lot of material for educators to use in training around how to handle these kinds of issues. I'm going to rush through this. I just wanted to draw attention to the problem with technical and scientific information that, like, we've been having to deal with here on campus as educators who are not experts in climate change but are dealing with this, and the fact that we have groups of eminent scientists on our campus who come to exactly opposite, published in exactly the same journal within each other about whether coal or gas is the environment. So, this is the idea of, what do we do with science and communicating about science and trying to convey science when we have people who are the real experts in the field going exactly opposite directions with sort of the interpretations of what it all means. So I'm going to do this as a poll. I just want you to think about some of these questions up here. true or false science is, the nature of science, because I think we need to think about these kinds of things to be sophisticated educators about science. Basically, a lot of this points us in the direction of making education hard, because it's all about complexity and lack of answers people like the most, which is black and white. And about what do we do with data? Well, you don't even know what data is relevant because different people think different is the important data to look at. And the same data we'll look at and interpret it entirely, come to entirely different conclusions. I just throw a few natural gas-related examples or one up on that one where I think I've seen people look exactly the same report, exactly the same conclusion, and they take diametrically opposed conclusions from it. And, you know, in my own work on natural gas, again, I've seen the opposite conclusions because you're using different methodologies, that each of them has hidden biases that most people don't understand. They're both legitimate, they're both important, but they can lead you to opposite kinds of directions and conclusions. And so how do you, as an educator who's not an expert in those particular areas, how do you deal with that kind of dissonance, if you will, in the message that you're trying to give out? And with because I do so much work with gas, I'm kind of looking at what I see as being very common in the problems that I have as an educator. One of them is just there isn't information available. We don't know so much. There's uncertainty. Another one is so many people have heard something which I believe to be, from what I know, actually misinformation. They're not going to listen to me just if I say you're wrong.
Right.
Because they don't, and why is that? It's because they don't necessarily trust me. So somehow I have to figure out a strategy for leading them to a conclusion, if I think it's important enough as an educator, to try and lead them to the conclusion themselves, which is not a very simple process. And just trust in all sources of authority and how that's grown so much, including about educators, and these are just two examples of, for a variety of reasons, Penn is perceived as being very biased in one direction on the shale gas issue. Cornell is perceived as being very biased in a different direction on the shale gas issue. And the reality is that we are tarred, if you will, by institutional affiliation. We also benefit from it. And the reality is, in each of these institutions, you can find an educator or a researcher, the entire spectrum. But like when a lot of people hear where you're from, you're just starting with whatever the affiliation or the association they have is. So you got to work against that. Even if it fits you, in a sense, you still have to work against it. Because, you see.
There's a chat from Nancy.
An important aspect of science education policies is the social constructs that we hold, is so vividly documented in Race, The Power of an Illusion. Highly recommended. So I think that's a reference to the film series and the community conversation, which is being started here in Tompkins County, a series of 3 films, and then dialogue and discussion about it, and I would strongly agree with that. I don't know if it's a book. It might have been originally a book. Maybe Nancy, if she knows, could put that in. But I do know that it's a series of 3 films that was some time ago, and it's being screened here in Tompkins County as a discussion starter and dialogue starter around race issues, which are obviously in almost all of our communities, a dialogue we could and should be talking about more openly. And it's a video series. Bottom line, in a way, is we can't really do our jobs very well. Maybe a better way to put it is we're limited in our effectiveness if we're really clear about how to work in situations where information actually becomes contested itself. And, in workshops, we would talk a lot more about the skills and the how-to, but I can't really do that in this kind of framework very easily, so I'm sort of more raising issues rather than trying to how to address them specifically. So I just, at the very end here, move on to education and advocacy, because I think that's such a big issue. This is a book, again, from an environmental education background, which is more where I come from, talk about how it's actually it's increasingly become a challenge about the line between these things being blurred and, what to do about that. So those people thinking about it. And here are just quick definitions of that book about the differences between education, advocacy, and an even more intense form of advocacy, which is indoctrination. And because we're nearing the end, I'm not going to read it out loud, but I'm just going to pause on this for a minute.
Share the handout with the whole group.
Okay. And this is also recorded if people want to go back to it too.
Looks like recording is working.
So, to get out of that book, the idea that what do you do in this context? Certain theories of education are focused on changing behavior of individuals primarily, promoting literacy, sort of informing with the goal of changing behavior. Others are really more focused on changing understanding of the world and sort of almost a more philosophical approach. How things work, and then sort of leaving the behavior more to some sort of flows from changed understanding, or that's not even concerned with it, and then much more focused on social change rather than individual change, which comes out of something called critical social theory, which is really about trying to change social values, and generally with a pretty clear notion of sustainability and social justice as the goals behind that, out of that kind of work. I just wanted quickly to throw up some of my own work with the question about whether it was to you guys more like education advocacy. This is work I did in the 90s with a group campus, which is all about composting, and we worked both on municipal, particularly yard waste composting, and agricultural waste composting, and I wanted to highlight out of one of the final reports of that, and there's still up on a website, the Cornell-sponsored website, things. The number of steps which governmental agencies can take to encourage agricultural composting. It shows promise as a waste management strategy for the future. It also carries additional costs that must be considered. The recommendations our recommendations to the state and the community essentially provide a framework to begin to build an agricultural composting infrastructure for New York State. And, it would seem that CC should focus on the understanding part, and especially that of science and its multi-dimensions, then. Do this. That's a great question, and I would look at Kim to say, if we really want to get into the answer to that, I would require another workshop, because I don't really have a simple answer, and I would agree to a large extent, given the word focus, but I don't think that focus suggests a focus as opposed to an exclusive engagement with that part of it. And I think that, I think the issue of science and its multi-dimensions and promoting, we might call scientific literacy, particularly in helping people we work with to become critical consumers, if you will. I'll always like that term, but critical users and partners with us in dialogue about what does the stuff coming out of the university mean. If we do that, we need people, for people to understand that the results of one single survey, one single peer-reviewed study does not end the scientific debate about something.
Right.
I'm going to just skip the poll part I was going to have. I was going to ask you whether you thought that was more education, advocacy, or indoctrination, and think about it, but I'll skip it because of time. I'm just going to up another example of some work that Ron and I have done. This is on shale gas and whether decisions should be made at the local or federal level, and I have conclusions in there and that, so is it education or is it advocacy? Because I'm sort of direct people from the way they have been thinking to thinking a different way. What I'm trying to just say is I don't think the line between education and advocacy is bright and clear. I think it's very blurry, and try and stay as much as possible, and I think we have a responsibility primarily as educators to stay on the education side of that line, but it's not going to be clear where that is. We need to do a lot more talking out loud, just like we need to do about race. I think we need to do a lot in a different way, a different level of importance, of course. But we need to do a lot more talking about what is crossing the line into advocacy and when is that appropriate and when isn't. I don't think we do nearly enough thinking about that in this kind of work. I mean, not public thinking, we may do private thinking. I'm almost done now. I just wanted to talk about a project that we're doing out of Cardi on how to communicate better with policymakers. No, I'm not just talking about Cardi, but how does the university engage more effectively with policymakers? And I just have this, we have a funded project that's doing some research, and we have a really exciting group of advisors from around the country to help us think about this, because surprisingly, there's very little work that's been done to talk about how does the university community engage most effectively with, particularly with national policymakers and community leaders. Surprisingly little in the academic literature, but there's a little bit.
So more professional development coming on.
Right. I just wanted to end with a little. Okay, I want to go back quickly to share application. To show an example of what I hope that we will be getting from as science, educators granted in science. I hope you can hear this.
Just a 2 minute?
Yeah, and I won't even go through the whole thing. So.
Catch you soon.
End this because it seems to not be connecting very well, but the point is he's talking nonsense. Nobody can understand what he's saying. The electronic translator is trying to turn it into English. So.
Interesting. Yeah.
But it sounds like English, but it isn't. I mean, so.
That's great.
The point is like this is what a lot of people perceive us as university-based people is like we're communicating very well. Anyway, I'm sorry I went a little over, but that's basically where I wanted to end it. So
we have a quick commercial. So there's more. If you really enjoyed this presentation, I certainly did. I appreciate it, David. And we have 2 more in the series. I think many of you who have registered, I've also registered for May 17th if you're available, Developing Leadership with Larry Vandervalk. And also June 21st, CC's role in enhancing community capacity, some of that building consensus education coming out with, Heidi Museu Kinsen and Celeste Carmichael on June 21st. So you're all registered. You'll be getting that information. We'll also follow up with a handout of this presentation so you can look through some of those slides that came at the end if you want to look a little further. And anything else, David?
I didn't really have time to read all of the chat that came in, but I will now, and if there's anything that seems like it would be useful to resend to in writing, I'll try and get back to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for participating. Take care.